If you are here, this meeting is being live streamed, just so you know. If you're here, you are at the Commission on Connecticut's Development Future Consolidated Housing Plan subgroup meeting. I got that right. So check for today. Thanks for joining us. It's a mouthful. This is our September meeting. We didn't meet in August, and we have 2 more meetings scheduled in October, November. I'm hoping we'll be able to wrap up our work then, but we can chat more about that later. I just wanted to take a moment before we move into introductions in our meeting to introduce Kaylee Pratt. Kaylee Pratt is a senior policy analyst and an attorney with the Partnership for Strong Communities. And in addition to writing all of her own office, raising a toddler, and doing all sorts of other things for the partnership, she's agreed to assist me and has been also working on some editing of our draft recommendations. So she's going to be helping from here on out with that process. So you'll see her name on our invitations and materials, as well as you'll see her face at our meetings. And she has a lot of expertise in the housing space. So glad to have you here with us, Kaylee. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. My slides today are really just to organize us, and then I'll pull up our draft recommendations so that we can start working through them on screen and make the most of our time today. So let's see if I can find my presentation here. Okay, I think you can all see that, right? Hope so. All right, so here's where we are, as I noted. So our agenda today is pretty simple. We'll just do a quick introduction and check-in as we usually do. Sometimes we have new faces come and go during the course of the months we've been working together. So always good just to remind ourselves of who we are and who's around us. We'll move into the bulk of our meeting, which will be walking through our current recommendations, really looking to get feedback. We have our 7 main recommendation areas and our primary recommendations. So we want to kind of reflect on those, make sure we're in the right space. And we've got some other areas where in our last meeting where we had talked about adding some additional information or clarifying. And so want to see if we can get some additional help besides Kaylee and I on drafting some of those. So that's what we'll be working on for most of today. We'll talk about that homework as well as next steps in our meeting dates at the end of our meeting. So meeting participation norms, as always, you can keep your camera on. That's preferred, but it's up for your comfort and ability. Ideally, we hope that folks are able to give full time during meetings and participate and focus versus multitasking. I know it's tempting, but if we'll be able to move through our work more quickly if folks are focused and get better buy-in and consensus if we're participating actively. Please use your hand raise feature when possible. I try to be fair by moving in order of when hands go up. So please use that rather than speaking out of turn. Move up your voice or listening as necessary. If you've been talking a lot, please consider pausing and letting others speak. If you haven't been speaking, please chime in and offer your expertise and thoughts throughout the meeting. And then I will do our best to respect our time. It's my goal to get us out at least a half hour early today, depending on how quickly we move through things, but we have an hour and a half if we need it for our discussion. So introductions quickly and a silly check-in question just for fun and to get us talking to one another. Your name and the hat you're wearing at this meeting. So some of us serve multiple roles in the community. You can share those if you want in addition to your day jobs or the primary sort of expertise you're bringing to this space. And then last time we had your favorite summer food. So this time it's just one thing you love about fall in New England, unless you're a grouchy person that doesn't like fall, in which case I'll only talk to you for purposes of the content of this meeting. So, all right, I will, we'll do popcorn style as we usually do. So Roger, why don't we start with you and then you can pick who goes next since you're top on my screen.
Hi, this is Roger Senserik. I'm the Communications Director for Connecticut Working Families. And regarding favorite thing of the fall in New England, festivals. I really like fairs and festivals. I have a 6-year-old and she is at the age that she likes all the rides, so it's always fun to take her. And I'll popcorn it to Will, I guess.
Thanks, Roger. Will Viederman. I'm from the Housing Authority of New Haven, Elm City Communities. My favorite thing about fall in New England, it's acceptable to eat cider donuts. and
It's acceptable all
particularly,
year round.
sure, it feels right. We'll say it's resonant.
Or
And I'll pass it to Kayla.
Hi, everyone. Like Kylie mentioned earlier, I'm with the Partnership for Strong Communities and assisting her with staffing this group. I'm going to take the easy way out and say my birthday is the first day of fall. So that's something that I enjoy about fall.
Who's next, Kaylee?
Oh, sorry. Marcia.
Marcia, I am representing a group called All In, particularly All In for Oxford. Interested in seeing that affordable housing is something that happens. And my favorite thing about fall is the fall colors. And I will pick Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Rebecca Auger with the Office of Responsible Growth at OPM. I think you've had maybe a couple of different people from OPM participating. It has landed with me now. I'm relatively new to the office, though. And my favorite thing about fall is apple picking. I will turn it over to Jim.
Welcome, Rebecca. I'm sorry you
Thank
drew
you.
the short straw. And Kaylee, when as you get to be my age, that'll probably be the worst thing about the fall. Anyhow, I'm Jim Paris. I'm the CEO of the Home Builders and Remodelers Association in Connecticut. I suppose my favorite thing about the fall would probably be, well, one, IPA beer, and two, my daughter's travel soccer season. So and maybe the order is transferable, who knows?
Or they can be done together, depending
Or
on
simultaneous. Yeah,
just a
then
soccer
you're
game,
that
right?
guy on the sidelines. Yeah.
Who's next, Jim.
Oh, let's see who has Margarita already gone?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm the chair of the Greenwich Planning and Zoning Commission. And then my favorite thing about fall, right? Well, for me this year, it's raining, guys. The droughts behind us. It was especially watching that fire in California. Glad that we got a bit of a reprieve. Climate change is a scary thing. And the next person is, sorry about the PSA, Cameron Clark.
Hello,
Cameron.
I'm Cameron Clark. I'm the acting clerk for the P&D committee right now. My favorite thing about fall has got to be all the small town fairs, especially the Berlin Fair.
Mhm.
And I'm going to just popcorn it over to Will Cromwell. Hi, I'm Will Cromwell. I'm the housing clerk, and me and Cameron are going to be working together on a lot of these. My favorite thing about fall is Halloween, and I'll popcorn it over to Ashley Portman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. I'm policy counsel for the majority leader, and I am helping to staff this working group.
I think
And
Anika.
my favorite thing is, sorry, forgot. My favorite thing is fall scented candles. And I think you're going to popcorn it to Anika, so I'll
Yeah, I
follow
think
your
Anika's
suit,
fine.
Kylie.
Yeah, I think Anika still has to go. Anika, you're there?
I'm here. Anika Singlemar. Apologies for my camera being off, but I'm on day 4 of a COVID quarantine in my 5-year-old's bedroom, and nobody wants to see what that looks like, I promise you. My day job is at the Yale Law School, where I teach clinics representing community development organizations, tenants facing eviction, homeowners facing foreclosure, and plaintiffs in fair housing actions. My favorite thing about fall is also Halloween, and specifically trick-or-treating in a walkable, dense neighborhood. And I think everyone's been covered.
Yep. I'm Kylie Goslin. I'm the executive director of the Partnership for Strong Communities and your co-chair. Our co-chair is not here today with us. That is Representative Q Williams, who I did get a chance to chat with yesterday in advance of the meeting. I have like a lot of favorite things about fall. Both my kids are September birthdays, so that's late September birthday, so that's part of it for me. I'm yet to get into enjoying the sports travel situation. I see it, Jim, as more of like taking away from my fall enjoyment, but I'm trying to change my mindset. But colors, fairs, food, all that stuff. All right. So thanks everyone again for sharing your time with us here today. Our goal and our charge, just to remind you all, that the legislature put forward is to come up with any recommendations, specifically legislatively advanceable recommendations as it pertains to the state's consolidated housing plan. The state consolidated housing plan is a document that HUD requires the state produce every 5 years to lay out how the Department of Housing intends to allocate certain federal housing resources. And just by way to set the table, our prior discussions have also noted that there have been other components of state housing planning that are either tied to that plan or direct back to that plan, or were separate plans entirely, like the state long-range housing plan. And so at our last meeting, we talked a bit about some of the other state laws that reference the consolidated housing plan, and which of those are sort of being actively engaged. In other words, where there's a requirement or a request that certain departments work together or share information related to the consolidated plan. We talked a little bit about some places where that's happening and some places where it's not happening or not happening as directly. And we also spent some time at our last meeting, which was way back in July. In July, walking through the draft recommendation areas, and there were 7, and we'll go through those today that we put together. And we spent some time talking about those, talking about maybe starting to change some wording or different case studies or other sorts of data, or sort of fleshing out of sections that we wanted to do. So you all made some recommendations on that. And so Kaylee and I spent some time in the interim 2 months working on trying to incorporate some of those recommendations, as well as beefing up data, the problem statement, a clearer statement about the consolidated housing plan itself, trying to make our recommendation sections more clear. And we shared that with you at the end, or I shared that with you all via email at the end of last week. I sent you clean and redlined versions of that. So what I want to use our time today to do, as I said before, is to walk through. I'm going to pull up the clean version of that. I will note that since I circulated that on Friday, I received some comments from a couple of you in between, and I did my best to try to reflect some of those. But I received some specific comments from Randy Pincus on this last draft. Randy Pincus is with the Department of Housing, and she's not able to be here today. I think also a family COVID situation. It's going around again. But did share with me some thoughts from her and colleagues at DOH about some different changes to make, places that where things would work or where they might not. And so you'll see those reflected where they were just easy or obvious changes, such as adding in a funding stream that we had neglected to include. I just added that in. Where Randy had specific comments about sections, you'll see that I noted those in here, and we can address those as we go through. After this meeting, I'm hopeful that we'll walk away with a little bit of homework for some of you to do in some of these sections. And my goal will be to turn around a new draft to you, including your homework and other work that Kaylee and myself and others will do in advance of our next meeting in October. And then ideally, we will have a draft that is as close to solid as we can get it in October, and we can use our October meeting to sort of do any more final changes, additions, that sort of thing. We have a November meeting, so if we do get into further conversation, we decide we really need that additional meeting to finalize, we have that as well. The goal is here to get something done by December. Any questions about that before I pull up the document about sort of where we are and where we're going? Okay, and I'll have a slide at the end that walks through those dates for you, so you don't feel like you need to commit them to memory or write them down right now. And I will also share a follow-up email, or Ashley will share a follow-up email with you after that will include some of that relevant information. All right, so I'm going to reshare my screen this time, and if I can pull up the right document, now I can't, I'm going to do that. 1 second. Okay. Sorry, I thought I had it open on my desktop, but I didn't. All right, now I can share it. Okay, can you all see that on your screen? Okay. We still have this in a memo format. I'll just note I'm also on the Affordable Housing Plan Subcommittee, and Tim Hollister has his in what looks like much more of a lengthy legal brief format. So we can, if you have suggestions about a recommended format you'd like to put our recommendations in, feel free to send those to me. I don't think there's any requirements as to how it's supposed to look. So I'm focused mostly at this point on content. But again, if you have thoughts on that, please let me know. So the beginning of our report just includes the charge, which I talked to you before. That's pretty straightforward and mostly a cut and paste of what the legislature asked us to do. Links throughout this so that any legislator or staff member, whoever may be reading this, the general public can easily click to links for the state housing plan. And we also mentioned the old state long range housing plan in here too. The next paragraph talks about what the consolidated plan for housing and community development is, and identifies the funding streams that are required to be included for instructional purposes as to how the state plans to spend them for HUD. It also identifies where in the state statute code the consolidated plan is referenced, and what the housing commissioner is required to do as part of that process. It also notes that CHAFA has some role in submitting information for the consolidated plan as well. We talked about that last time. So that's identified in this section. If any of you have thoughts, edits, changes on this sort of more mundane description of the current status of the con plan, as well as the other statutes that are identified, please feel free to jump in and let me know, or send those to me separately. And we have a deeper list below of other reference statutes per our conversation, which we'll get to in a minute. The next section we talked about adding last time, and this is a problem identification section. So this ideally clearly articulates sort of why there's a consolidated housing plan, why we have different affordable housing funding streams, broadly what the need in Connecticut looks like at this point in time. Most of the statistics you see here that Kaylee entered are from a couple different sources. And so we have a note here to actually put those sources in, but they're all reliable sources like the National Income Housing Coalition, Urban Institute, as well as some state data. Margaret, I see your hand up. Why don't you go ahead?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Is it okay to put in comments now, or do you want us to wait?
No, sure. Feel free. I will do my best to add.
So, okay, so I love the fact that we're integrating this.
Uh-huh.
We had talked at one point about including job creation. I believe that I remember seeing an article, and Kaylee is data, right? That we're dead last in job creation in the state. Isn't that part of the problem? I'm just asking, and could we find a source on that? Because one of the things we had also talked about in other conversation when we discussed this is lining up housing with where we have jobs. So if we're creating jobs, let's get the housing near it, and let's give people a chance to move forward. And that's really, I'm starting to digress, so I'll stop there. But can we talk about job creation? Is Kaylee the right person for that? And the other thing is, when we talk about the Connecticut real estate market and how expensive it is, at the same time, and maybe this is related to the job creation, we have had a very slow growing real estate market with low turnover, and it was until COVID. Should we talk about that at all, or is that not appropriate for here? So we may have high housing costs, but we've also had a troubled real estate market. Could we dig into that, or do you guys not want to get into that?
Anika, go ahead if you want to respond to that, and I'll go back to some.
Yeah, I'm so confused by how those things would fit here that I would actually invite Margarita to draft this portion of the section.
Thank you.
For her. I feel like it's completely unfair to Kaylee to ask her to make sense of anything
Okay,
of what you
okay.
said.
I'd
So
love
if
to.
you did that, I think that if you could propose it for the group, I don't think that would be a bad idea. But
Great.
honestly, I think
Okay.
prices sort of speak for themselves, and if they're too high, they're too high. And we know that
Right.
people want to live here because the housing prices are high.
Okay. So
Hold on.
Okay.
I
So
did not interrupt you. So
sorry.
thank you. We know people want to live here because the prices are high. There's no question about that. We know that there are jobs today that are unfilled. We know that there's a gap there. We know that we're also near to dead last in units created, notwithstanding what the prices are. You know, you can get to a point here where you would be writing a dissertation. I guess I'd invite you to dig in a little bit. But if this turns into a Yankee Institute fake think piece, I don't think we're doing any of ourselves any favors. I don't think that's what we're here to do.
No, I agree with you. I think it's just a question of how do you create balance in the state, and where do you build the housing, and where is your real opportunity? My community's
Are
in
you
net.
proposing to tell people where they ought to live? I mean, what do you mean?
No, not at all. I'm just saying job creation is important to helping break the cycle. And could we make a point about that? That one of the things to do is can we say something about that? Another question for you, and this is really, I'm just asking the question. I have no direction on the answer. Should we be referencing AMI or SMI? Is AMI a better indicator? You have how many people don't make enough income to have, you're on AMI.
Right.
Is it that the indicator? Should it be, does that show the very lowest income levels? Just asking.
Yeah,
For
so-
us, AMI is so low, is so much lower than I'm sorry, SMI is so much lower that we're very focused on how do we create housing for the deeply affordable housing.
So I will say, right, the deeply affordable housing, extremely low income is considered 30%. I'll hold on one second. I have something I thought might be useful.
Yeah, so we use SMI for that, and that's why I don't know, but maybe it's not indicative for, outside of Fairfield County, so I don't want to mess people up.
I use SMI because that's what's required by 830G, and you all don't care about anything else. So you're just trying to build for 830G, and because that's all you care about, you build what's required by the statute, and that's fine. I mean, I'm okay with it. I'm
fair.
Okay, but you're interrupting me again.
But you were insulting me. Don't pick on me. Don't say what I care about. I wouldn't be here if I cared, if I didn't care.
So it is, I'll just say, all of the HUD data, all of the available data is tied to AMI. I can't
that's my question.
I can't see a lot of benefit to putting it on staff members and others to add in, except to maybe add a sentence or two pointing out that there are portions of the state where the area median income is significantly higher than it is in the remainder of the state, and take it as that. But as a general matter, HUD and all of the collectors of data here collect it based on AMI.
That was my question. I was asking you a question. Which indicator really relays the need? And you guys are saying, no question, it's AMI. I'm good with that.
No, they both relay need. It's just that the people who work in this field don't generally speak in terms of SMI. The only thing that speaks in terms of, but of course they both relay need. I feel like you're trying to trap us into saying something.
No. Again, Anika, you're giving me motives and deciding what I care about, and that's not fair of you. I asked a very straight question. What is a better indicator of the housing problem, which is the section this is in, the percentage of people earning at AMI or at SMI? We tend to look at SMI because I work with Greenwich Communities, we're looking at the most deeply affordable level that they need, that they're creating for housing. So it's different in the rest of the state. I'm good with that. That's why I raised the question.
I think what the important thing to note here is that, we still, even though we're making recommendations for how the state should look at the consolidated plan, perhaps more broadly, the consolidated plan ties to federal funding streams as well as state funding streams, and all of those use area median income as the measurement. And that's really the measurement tool, not just for all these funding streams, but for eligibility program requirements and policy making. So I think it would make sense for us to stick with that rubric, since it's universally how the funding streams we're talking about are measured.
Okay.
I shared, before I get to Roger, I shared on the screen, this is the latest national low income housing data. And Margarita, you're right in that the AMI varies from place to place. So we know, for example, right, the area median income is going to be a little higher in Fairfield County, but we know that actually the gap, the affordability gap, is much higher in Fairfield County, because the rents and housing costs are much higher there than they are, say, even in the Hartford County area, or in Eastern Connecticut or Western Connecticut. So what you see here are just the statewide averages, and in terms of what an AMI, the area median income broadly for the state is 30,000 for 30% AMI, I should say that. So that's that extremely low income. When you look down, you can see that's where the deepest need are. So so for this purpose, this is 40 units are available for every 100 households that are at that 30% area median income and below. And this, if you want to go in and explore the NLIHC report or the Urban Incident Report or any of the other reports that have been, but this one has it has region by HUD metropolitan statistical area data. So you can look at what the fair market rent is for a 2-bedroom in county versus what the income is there. So these are the standards for what we're using. I see Roger had your hand up, so I want to, one more thing, Margarita, too, you talked about the job creation component. I note too, we did talk about that last time in our conversation as well. Opportunity map that the Department of Housing uses and the State Housing Finance Authority that sets like low, moderate, and high, and some variations in that of opportunity. It creates basically some different program guidelines for each of the funding streams, includes the availability of jobs as part of that measurement. So areas that have more job opportunities get more points in that opportunity and that opportunity map calculation that the state uses. So it's already it's already built into the that tool that both our state housing finance groups use, if that makes sense. So we can certainly mention the need for us to be thoughtful about housing placement as it relates to jobs and transit. But it is something that the opportunity map component, which we talk about in here, includes, and it's a policy tool that the state is using already.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Yeah, no problem. Roger, you had your hand up, so I want to make sure I.
Yes, it was a quick note on the job creation. Connecticut has really sluggish job creation, in part because we are not increasing population. You cannot have more jobs if you don't have more workers. And if you don't build housing for workers to live here, there is not going to be new jobs created. So it's not a matter of the housing market hurting jobs, or that the jobs are not, we don't have enough jobs for the housing market. It's that we don't have workers. We are not letting people here. The other thing regarding job housing placement, I think that we covered transit-oriented development a bit further down. But in terms of carbon footprint and land use and density, I think we can include the jobs in that section, in the sense that new housing will be easily accessible with low carbon transportation alternatives and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we have that section a little lower, Roger, so we'll get to that momentarily. I will, as Kaylee and I noted, the information that we've added in here, I think it's important that we add citations for any data that we're citing here in sections. So Kaylee and I are going to work to do that in between, but these are, as I noted, from the sources we talked about. So on that note, if you submit any any material for inclusion or any submit an area that you think we should consider adding, please make sure you include cites for that, so that if it's a reliable source, we can cite it, and that we make sure that we reference that site appropriately in the report. We'll use footnotes. That's fun. Anything else in this section that you all feel should be added? I'm sorry, I'm scrolling fast, but in this problem identification section. In the next section, I've worked to try to structure our recommendations so they're bolded and clear. But this section really outlines the primary recommendations that we set forward. So the first is to consider incorporating the 7 elements outlined below as part of the consolidated plan, beginning with the 2025 plan. We also note that they could be incorporated into a broader state housing plan document, like the former state long-range housing plan. But regardless, we emphasize the need for a broader, more comprehensive guiding state housing policy doctrine that applies to all housing and community development funding, state and federal, and that such guidance should include more specific location-based elements, actionable steps for implementing such guidance, measurable goals based on needs assessments, and a regular plan for assessing progress on those goals. I also bolded the recommendation that we discussed that this report include a recommendation that there be more staffing at particularly the Department of Housing, which oversees the Consolidated Housing Plan. And that's not only because it was requested by the Department of Housing, but because we had a conversation about the recognition that there's insufficient staffing at the state level right now to complete the level of housing planning, the level of data analysis, and the level of data collection, probably that is needed now, but definitely that would be required by the additional elements we're recommending in this report. And in fact, I think when we look at some of the places where there was required collaboration for the Consolidated Housing Plan and the other statutes, which are referenced below, some of those are happening and some of those aren't. And it's in large part because we don't have a sufficiently staffed, at least in my opinion, we don't have enough state staff folks to do the level of work that we would like to see as it relates to housing planning. Haley went through and did some research per the conversation we had last time with Anika and others about the number of places in Connecticut general statutes where the consolidated plan is referenced. And we thought it was important to include these here so that legislators know as they're drawing anything from this and making any additional recommendations, that there's several other departments and reports that intersect with these recommendations. I saw Rebecca has her hand up. Rebecca?
Thank you. Only because I'm joining the conversation late. Did you guys discuss whether the state POCD or Conservation and Development Policies Plan would be another avenue for incorporating some of these recommendations?
Yes, some of our earlier conversations, Rebecca, looked at the different plans that the state currently has, as well as plans that existed in the past, like the state long-range housing plan, and looked at whether we had some extensive discussions about where sort of our charge ends and the recommendations sort of begin with respect to things beyond the consolidated plan. So we had a pretty in-depth discussion about whether we should move beyond this to either make recommendations about other plans or recommend things be added to those other plans, but really the legislature specifically asked this group to specifically address the consolidated plan. So that's why you'll see in here the need for a broader, more comprehensive guiding state housing policy doctrine, but noting that these elements could be incorporated into another existing state. So POCD may be one of those things, and it could be that the state decides to move some of these elements into that, but we did have that discussion at the beginning. If folks want to chime in though, and have additional thoughts on that, please feel free to do so.
And just one follow-up, which maybe belongs up in the introduction. Is it worth pointing out that entitlement communities are preparing their own con plans? Because my understanding of con plans they're so limited in HUD's prescription as to content that I wonder if it's helpful that legislators who may be reading this understand the true nature of the con plan.
Yeah.
I didn't understand that.
I don't want to, again, I don't know the conversations you've already had, but my understanding of comp plans are they're highly prescribed by HUD and their content and even how they are written and how they are uploaded into HUD's database system and all of that. And so it may be helpful for some legislators to think about, entitlement communities are also preparing these plans and just kind of understand the real nature of them. They're not as broadly policy based as some of the recommendations I think you all are considering are right now. I don't think they envision them being that broadly policy based.
Okay. That is a valuable note and consideration here. For those of you who don't know, I think we may have discussed this in the beginning that all of these funding streams here are primary, for the most part, they come from the state and they go through this from the federal government. They go through the State Department of Housing. However, certain cities, certain communities, typically larger communities with deeper income needs, get a large portion of HUD funds directly and allocate those funding streams on their own. So, for example, the city of Hartford receives CDBG funds on its own outside of the programs you see listed here, whereas like the small cities money comes through the CDBG small cities money comes through the state. So what Rebecca's referring to is the fact that there are HUD funding streams, a lot of HUD funding in the state that comes through entitlement cities and is spent by those cities in accordance with plans that they put together, in addition to the state, the funding that the State Department of Housing is spending. I don't know if folks have any questions about that. I don't think we have any. We don't have a DOH person here today, so I would have to ham and egg that on my own. I see Rep. Williams joined us. Hello, co-chair. Any other thoughts or comments on the recommendation component, which I will scroll back down to here? Do these recommendations feel right? Namely, that we have these 7 areas, the need for a broader state housing policy doctrine that brings things together, whether that's this or another vehicle, and then acknowledging the need for additional state staffing in order to account for the recommendations that we're putting forth. Okay. If you think of something or you have additional thoughts on that, again, please feel free to email me. The first recommendation we had was for this biennial needs assessment. Part of one of the first meetings we had, we asked for folks to come up with sort of broad recommendations based on their original needing of the plan. And multiple folks talked about, while there is some needs assessment, doing a broader and more in-depth needs assessment on a more regular basis as a state and incorporating that. This is where reference to the opportunity map elements comes into play. So we recommended that we as a group came up with the recommendation to that the state conduct a housing needs assessment every 2 years. The reasoning behind that, I believe, in part because I drafted it, but we also all talked about it, was the change that we've seen in housing needs in the last 2 years was quite drastic. So while our housing costs have always been very high and we've always had an affordable housing shortage, to Margarita's point, even when the market was slower, we still had a drastic affordable housing need. That need increased as housing costs went up, and as our housing stock, as Jim knows, has been slow to catch up from the slowdown that Margarita described. So we felt, or at least I felt in our discussion, that having a 2-year, every 2 years was necessary. Randy reached out and said that the 2-year goal is challenging for a couple of reasons. One, we know that the staffing is an issue, so we can all decide whether we want to put out the best recommendation and let the state figure out the staffing. But also, which is a valid point, that oftentimes the data that we're looking at in a needs assessment can be 12, 18, or even 24 months behind where we actually are. So sometimes collecting that data and packaging it takes time. So noting that she noted that a 5-year plan was more realistic and perhaps would better capture things that a 2-year is always going to look a little old, but noting that even a 5-year is going to include old data. So I wanted to throw that out to all of you as we went through this. There didn't seem to be any issues or challenges from this group on including a needs assessment as part of as part of our recommendations. So this is really just as to whether you feel, or we all feel, that a state supported housing needs assessment should be conducted every 2 years versus every 5 years. I know there are 2 participants that raised their hand. Unfortunately,
Let Will go first.
okay, sorry, I didn't see who first, and I know it orders them, but I can't see that on my screen. All right, so you said Will Vierman, you had your hand up, and then was it Marcia or who was second? So Will, why don't you go ahead then?
Yeah, I think Randy's point makes a lot of sense. I think as I've been digging into needs assessments in the last couple of days. And one of the things that, like, so much depends on the methodology, right? Are we looking at, like, how are we defining shortages? How are we defining markets? I think when you look at a jobs-based shortage, for example, you get a lot of spillover from New York City that may not get caught in, like, census data, for example. And so I do wonder, the Furman Center through its Local Housing Solutions project has it with Policy Map, has just like an ongoing needs assessment that just auto pulls ACS data, I think. And I do wonder if there is the opportunity to recommend, and maybe this is too much in the weeds, but to say, like, an every 5-year methodology review combined with a living data update. As our technology improves, are there ways that we can make a needs assessment less burdensome to DOH and also pretty responsive to whatever the most recent data is, even if it is slightly delayed?
Okay.
I'm really glad that Will got to go first because I'm going to build on some of what he said. 5 years makes a lot of sense, even though it may leave us with unaddressed problems. But is there a way that the work that's being done on the 830Js and the affordable housing plans can feed into that needs assessment? We did needs assessment. Frankly, we struggled with what would be a good methodology for that, and how to figure out. But could somehow those data sets go together? Could DOH use it? Is OPM analyzing it enough to be able to gather something from what the towns have developed to feed it into the state level?
Are you so you're saying that
5 years, and could we use, is there any benefit to what the towns are doing in terms of their affordable housing plans, because there's a needs assessment in those affordable housing plans? But looking at the statewide ones, we were all over the place on how we assessed our needs. So is there a way that, to what Will's saying, once the tech gets better, maybe we can get there faster? Can we utilize, could the state, could DOH, could someone utilize what the towns are doing in their needs assessments now?
Aren't those, what's the complete percentage or the completion percentage of those affordable housing plans at this moment? We're not even at 50%, are we?
we're
yeah.
past
Way.
50%. I think the question I have is how many towns, one, had the resources to do, Margarita, what you guys said you were doing, and conduct an actual needs assessment versus and were those done with appropriate staffing and quality data? So I don't know. I know there's a lot of folks that are going through those plans, including some of my own team. Is my concern, I guess, would be
How good is the data?
some of those needs assessments might be really good. In other towns where they didn't have the resources or didn't take that step, they won't be that good. Where they're solid, certainly.
Well, and in all honesty, what if someone told us exactly what we needed to do and it wasn't resource intensive? Thank you, Kaylee, for having such a great data set out of PSC, because I used it a lot. I started with all the data there and dug from there, because I didn't even know what questions I should be asking. So yes, I know that maybe the data is not good enough right now, but is it useful to suggest that it get better? And maybe not resource intensive, because it's hard for smaller towns. we do that needs assessment, and could that feed into the state consolidated plan somewhere? Because isn't that kind of the idea?
Yeah, so what I will note is that there's another sub working group that's working on the affordable housing plans, and I will go back and look at that report, but I'm fairly certain that that recommendations around needs assessment and data is part of that. So that may more properly belong over there. And some of the, like all the data you pull from housing data profiles, that's primarily all census data and state data. So it's data the state's using anyway. So there's nothing in there that would be, I guess I could just question if a town is using all the same data that the state's going to be using anyway. But one of the things we talked about later in the report, I think it's tailoring plans to communities, is incorporating recommendations and information from the AHPs into the consolidated housing plan more broadly. So
and there's
covered there.
There's great things like how far are people traveling to the job? I mean, there were all these questions to ask. I'm just saying, if we got those needs assessments in the AHPs, if we got those structured so that they were useful for the con plan, then the state would have, what could we add to it? How do we enrich it? Because you start looking at different pieces. I started with that data, started digging through the census, all of that. Just suggesting, could we improve the next round of AHPs so that they can feed something useful into the con plan? And isn't that a part of why they exist, or is it just to help the municipalities plan?
I think they're more to help the municipalities plan, but I think there's useful information that I think to the point where we have a comment in here later about the consolidated plan should take into account AHP recommendations. I think your comments, Margarita, may be more, I want to go back and look at the current draft of the affordable housing plan group, because some of that may be fit more squarely within that. But I have a note here for us to look into that. And so Will has his hand up too.
Yeah, I think the disparate quality of local A30J plans is a pretty good argument for not using them.
Okay.
And I think is a really strong argument for like a statewide methodology. I think the A30J plans would be interesting if they were enforceable, but I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing are in fact the legacy of failures at the local level, and that maybe there is a need for state action. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense to me to put the A30J plans in here at all, really.
But Will, what if they gave? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Margaret.
I just wanted to ask if the state gave us all the methodology just for the future.
Right.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
one of the things that Tim Howell, the Affordable Housing Plan Group, is going to be working on is giving better. They're giving the state recommendations on how they can give more clarity to the towns on what to include next time. That's really their scope and their task.
Fantastic.
But if you want to jump back in, you can.
Yeah, I think my point is just that if we're thinking about a needs assessment, if like we wouldn't have this problem if localities were actually motivated to do the right thing if they got the data. And so I think we need to I think we need to go beyond just like providing data to localities and look at other options. But whatever.
Before we move on, I just want to solidify our feelings on the 5 versus 2 years, so we have that clarified for next draft. Is there anyone who doesn't agree or still has concerns about, as Will suggested, moving to a more thorough a needs assessment every 5 years, but using regular data updates in the interim? If you have any questions about that, can you raise your hand so we can work through those? Okay. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Okay. All right. So we'll move that to 5 then, with a note that that regular data updates should be produced, and ideally that needs assessment would be completed the year before the consolidated plan is put together, or 2 years before, so the plan draft is working off of the latest needs assessment. assessment. The next section we had was tailoring plans to communities.
I'm
Lots of-
sorry, Kylie, would it make sense to itemize what that interim report would look like, or what expectations? I mean, not that I would know what that would look like or sound like, but I don't, maybe even DOH can give us advice on what they think would be feasible to report on, and what would be helpful for us to know, or for the public to know.
Okay.
Which also says we're agreeing that DOH needs more resources, right?
Yes, they do. Let's ask DOH for data inclusion plan. So just noting that for myself, and Kaylee, don't let me forget what I mean by what I'm writing down. Kaylee will take better and more thorough notes than I will anyway. Tailoring plans to communities. So you all had a bunch of different things you wanted to include, ways in which the consolidated plan or a broader statewide housing planning vehicle should really be looking at the differences between communities and its recommendations. This related to both need as well as environmental concerns, looking at racial and economic segregation, using the opportunity map, which gets to the job availability component Margarita is bringing up. Talking about mobility and opportunities for increasing homeownership opportunities, and looking how that may be different from town to town based on housing stock, as well as looking at transit options and as a part of that. Bruce, who's not here today. So there's a couple places here where we're obviously, Kaylee and I have identified where additional assistance would be helpful from all of you. One group talked about objective setting for municipalities, and there's been a lot of conversation in the state more broadly about how to set objectives that are specific and tailored to communities based on their based on job availability, based on infrastructure and other things. So I wanted to note that is one place where we identified that we would like to add more, but which your support would be helpful. And then an additional component about planning around transit options. We added a little bit of language there, but additional, if anyone wants to take a stab at really highlighting the value of including transit as an important component of community-specific recommendations in a broader state housing plan. If you're willing to volunteer, just raise your hand. Roger.
It's not
let me just
exactly
take Roger first, and then I'll come back.
It's not exactly volunteering. It's a note on the fiscal capacity. Probably we can do something regarding comparing. We have the grant list, we have the mill rates by town. So both of them are fairly objective measures on how much money a town can raise and how much money the town is actually raising and investing on itself. So just adjusting grant list per capita or comparing median meal rates and adjusted with the state help or something like that, we could probably get something around this.
Okay.
Go ahead, Margarita.
I think Roger just said it. I was struggling with what we meant specifically by fiscal capacity. So you're saying how much money could the municipality raise, Roger? That was your point?
I mean, some towns have much lower meal rates than average. And
yes,
that shows that they have a big grant list and they can potentially raise a lot more money, and they are not doing it. So fiscal capacity, that could be a good guidance for fiscal capacity.
Yeah, I would say too that it's rare that a town invests and puts in its own money in an affordable housing project, right? Most of the time that's state funded, but the towns could. One way the towns do frequently support affordable housing, to your point, Roger, is through different tax abatements or tax reduction agreements that they create. And so that's another place where you can look at a town's fiscal capacity and say, this town, based on its grand list and its, and its mill rate, could support a tax abatement for a project, or could invest in a project in that way. Oftentimes those tax abatements serve as a sort of adjunct financing stream, if you will, for some affordable housing projects, which they allow developers to build out a pro forma that includes an expectation of a certain level of tax payments. So we can play around with that a little, but I really would welcome any other additional thoughts on that. So I have Roger's suggestion about the consideration of objective factors like mill rates and grand lists as it relates to the consideration of local fiscal capacity and objective setting. I know Anika had some thoughts on that too, so I'll try to circle back with her as well. Let me see what else. Anything else in this section? And if anyone, like I said, wants to take a stab at the TOD, we could do some of that in-house, but I also want to be honest about our own capacity as an organization. We're doing our best to support this, but I also want to make sure that there's input from everyone, and that this isn't a partnership drafted, but something that we all have had input in. Roger?
Can you develop a bit what it means for by saying potential for transit options? It's like lines that are planned or lines that are going in the middle of nowhere and we don't have housing around. I don't know exactly what the text means here.
Oh, I see. I thought you were offering help. That's why I was getting excited. I think this was a recommendation from Bruce last time, and I think the specific was about considering the availability of transit as part of if the state housing plan, consolidated plan, whatever the state housing plan is going to make recommendations that are more specifically tailored to communities versus broad recommendations, that transit access is one that should be considered when looking at towns, either on a town by town specific basis or broadly looking at where affordable housing development makes sense. So this could look at, we have here potential for new transit options as a result of regional planning and interest and established infrastructure that would support such expansion. But it could also look at, you could say something more specific here about existing transit and, the importance of building housing near transit. So, like I said, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I want to make sure that what we're producing has true buy-in and is part of the group. Rebecca, I know you have some experience in this space, so you didn't let up about your
no, I didn't. And I'm not volunteering right now. I guess I have a question. Were you envisioning that these are objectives set for classes of municipalities, like rural municipalities, urban municipalities, not specific municipalities? Is that what you were envisioning?
That's what I am thinking that this would look like, although we didn't lay that out specifically, but we could.
I'm just wondering, because as you talk about TOD, whether there's a regional,
yes,
whether regional objective setting makes more sense, because if we think of TOD and maybe we're thinking of a specific transit line, the objectives may be around that line, which may cover both urban and suburban communities. So I'm just, I don't want to get hung up. I don't want to mucky up the works here, but I'm just wondering if there is consideration given to regional objective setting in some fashion.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
I think it wasn't just Bruce. A lot of us were saying this whole idea of you want to help, again, you want to have it be convenient to transit. And how do you talk about that?
All right, noting the time, I was hoping we get out of here in an hour, but we can, I think we can do this quickly. I'm making edits as I move, so just ignore that. Identify opportunities, incentives for rehabilitation and preservation. This was our note that there are opportunities that we should be clearly identifying for rehab and preservation, and some of these funding streams can be used for rehabilitation and preservation, some can't, but that specifically where we're at risk of losing affordable housing units every year because they reach the end of their affordability restriction timeline, the group felt it was important to note that any report should acknowledge that and identify specific places where resources should be targeted for preservation of existing affordable housing units as opposed to creating new units. Randy noted that this is already a part of the consolidated plan. And now that we've started this, it's been several months since I've read their consolidated plan, which, as you all recall, because I know you all read it too, it was very lengthy. So I will go back and look at that again, as will Kaylee. If it is that it is already included, would you all be okay with us including a statement that just says this is a really important part of the consolidated plan, and as Connecticut's housing stock continues to age, we recommend continuing to target preservation, so that we're saying something about preservation, but acknowledging that it's something that's currently included at some level? Anybody have any issue with that? Okay, I will.
I think it's brilliant.
We will update that in our next draft then, and share that back out. You'll see the update and the outcome of that in the next draft. A bunch of you all wanted to talk about housing quality and healthy homes. This is something that came up later in our conversation. Some of these housing finance streams that the consolidated plan looks at can be used, as we said, for rehabilitation. And one of those things is often dealing with mold and lead abatement and all of the other challenges that go on with the really old housing stock we have here as a state as a whole, but also much of our affordable housing stock is aging. So we included some language on this. The partnership put some language together, Kaylee and I, but it's, I can't recall who was leading the charge on this particular issue. We obviously have some expertise in this space, but I know there's other groups that have more. And so I wanted to ask in this section whether there's anybody who wanted to add additional language to this or felt that this warranted more specific targeted recommendations.
No, it's a huge problem. And it's a particular problem because a lot of the NOAA doesn't meet building code standards.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find out how many units a place has. And then you find out the New York City problem is so illustrative with the drowning and the people dying. I mean, that's just the greatest concern that I believe we should have about some of this naturally occurring housing.
Yes, and unfortunately, there's not. We need NOAA. We need affordable
Yes.
rental units that aren't subsidized, but we don't have a lot of great tools to rehab those. And oftentimes, the cost of rehabbing them far exceeds the value of the house and the rent, and the numbers are upside down. We have this problem in Hartford, right? And this tends to lead to blighted properties where you have a sort of extraction method for landlords where they're just collecting rent but not putting anything back in because the taxes and the numbers don't work out, right? The cost to own the building and bring it up to code is far more than
Exactly.
so we don't have a lot of
challenge
to deal with that effectively. We have some, like Chapa's small multifamily loan program, but that's $15 million a year. So one of the things we recommended was looking at other funding streams. If we're going to create a broader housing planning document, looking at other funding streams that cover this or don't cover this need, and making sure that this topic is something that's given some level of attention in a state housing plan, especially if needs assessments are showing that we have a lot of this type of housing, which
I think it's the only answer. Sorry, I forgot to raise my hand because I feel very strongly about this. It's all over the place, and people's lives are in danger. And how do you address it?
Yeah. It's not something that can be addressed typically with the natural market resources, and that's part of the challenge. So that's a place where I think conversation about state investment would be helpful. All right, we're almost getting to the end. 3 more. Expand evaluation of prior performance. This is something that almost everyone seemed to agree on or make a recommendation around after reading the initial proposal, and that was that we really need to look at our past performance with a harder eye and include detailed evaluation on our goals and metrics, and specifically the outcomes of needs assessments. Have we moved the needle on needs assessments from plan to plan? in a broader housing planning document that took into account that needs assessment and ideally was very focused on that evaluation would give us a better assessment of whether the plan we put in place worked or whether it panned out and it all. And that could help lead to future recommendations. I see, Jim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so the language, I was wondering if it could be a little more specific. Here, it identifies the need for assessing whether or not something worked or not. But I was also wondering, and this may not be the place for it, I don't know, if we could, identify the impediments to the success of a particular program and make recommendations.
Great idea. So, when you talk about best practices, I'm sorry, I forgot to wait.
That's okay. Go ahead. I was just
Okay, so when you talk about best practices, you mean non-funding, right?
not for this section necessarily. We have the non.
Okay, that was down there. Yeah, so there've got to be, do the COGS have anything? I volunteer definitely to see if we've got something in the COGS. What people have done that has worked. Several communities down here are looking at implementing inclusionary zoning.
Mm-hmm.
So all multifamilies and everybody's sharing what their regs look like that for inclusionary zoning and how to go about it. So things like that. Can you create funds? I could give this a shot and send in some ideas that I've picked up around the state. I think it probably needs input from the rest of you. Local funding, a fund, inclusionary zoning. What else and what other ideas do we have to enable housing?
So this should have included consolidated plan. So one of the things, sort of the evaluation of past performance of a consolidated plan, including needs assessments, but this was broader and this came from Anika saying, hey, we should look at best practices across the country. Which states are doing a really good job of assessing and measuring their affordable housing performance? And, are there lessons learned from, I don't know, Oregon that's doing a really good job of assessing its consolidated plan performance? Kaylee and I spent some time looking into this and didn't come up with anything. Like your idea of highlighting some local, some sort of local best practices. I'm not sure inclusionary zoning or I know Fairfield, for example, has an affordable housing fund. Stanford does too, where folks can pay into the fund.
Yeah, and we just did that too. We just created a trust for affordable housing. You can feed it. You can feed it with fees, which is what Stanford does.
Yeah.
The other thing, and we probably should keep bringing this up, is tax abatements. And again, to the point that Roger was making, it depends on the capacity of the municipality to give a tax abatement, but it's still it can be effective. And so tax abatements, inclusionary zoning, trust funds, any kind of fee that some towns around the country have, what's it called when you sell a house? There's a transfer. I know the state has one already.
There's a transfer tax.
Yeah. I'm just throwing out ideas for a list that we could make of encourage people to explore these things.
So I think the ideas that you're throwing out are good. They are, I think, good local best practices for promoting affordable housing at the local level. So I'm not sure that they belong in the consolidated plan, which is more of a statewide housing planning document. However, I think that they may also belong in the recommendations that Tim's putting out for the affordable housing plan is something to consider about there. But there may be a way to fit that in here too. I think what I think it was Anika who originally raised that we should look at best practices more around this topic, which is we're talking about expanding evaluation of prior performance and how one measures the success of their affordable housing funding or their plan. And that's what we were trying to dig into. I see a bunch of hands up. I saw Jim, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I had it up. I put it down, but I think you kind of said what I was about to say about this being a state plan as opposed to a local plan. I would just caution too, if we are starting to talk about inclusionary zoning, that we're not talking about the town with the the prettiest regulation, but that maybe if those inclusionary zoning came with some sort of evidence of its success, right? Sometimes even the best laid plans of mice and men can go untoward, and in inclusionary zoning could yield less units, in fact, right, if not complemented by a whole bunch of robust kind of incentives for developers to build with those inclusionary measures. And again, like if a municipality has a trust fund, how much of it has been used to date for building new units? How much does that cost developers and impacted the development of market rate or more development in that community, right? There's pros and cons to all of this, and I just want to make sure that people are aware of them.
Yes, there are definitely, as you noted, considerations on both sides of the proponents and opponents of inclusionary zoning, or elements of it that have been cited as positive or negative. Anything else, Will, on this best practices section, or the evaluation of prior performance and the recommendation that we include some more best practices here?
Yeah, I guess this gets a little bit into the like how much of this, how much is this a housing plan and how much is this the con plan, and how we're looking for like how we evaluate success. And maybe this is just a best practice question, but I wonder if we are getting too far from the con plan purpose in like evaluating our success or failure. I don't think it's particularly controversial why we have huge housing costs in the state, and I think the solutions, or some of the solutions to get there, are really obvious. And I do wonder if it would be more valuable for this plan to very explicitly look at the performance of the con plan and the funding streams that come through the con plan explicitly. Wow. Because like we can write a thing that says, hey, we need to loosen our zoning laws, but like how do the funding streams intersect with the affordable housing strategy and the needs assessment, to me, is a maybe more relevant evaluation for this document.
Yeah, I get that. I think this is what we were looking for here again, was where are there other states doing a good job of assessing the success of their consolidated plan or their state housing plan, whatever that may look like. What are they measuring? How are they doing it? So that's what we're looking for. I think Margarita's notes are good, but as we talked about, they're targeted, I think, more towards what municipalities can do. I agree with Will. It's hard. I like you. I'm like, let's recommend inclusionary zoning or whatever. But I think one of the things to do is try to keep ourselves within the scope of it here, right? That's the challenge of all of these work groups, is to not, go in 18 different directions. But I will.
So you guys, I'm good with that. I was thinking, go ahead. I was thinking that the state. I'm just going to
move it to look at
that the state is the sum of what all of its towns do. But I really like what Will said of we should be looking at the state standalone in totality and not be getting, in all fairness, I was thinking provincially, like thinking we all add up to the con plan. But Will is saying, no, look at what the con plan was and what has been achieved. I think that's a great point.
Okay. But I do want to look at the AHP to see if it includes those recommendations or strategies.
Okay.
As part of their recommendation for town's consideration in the 830J stuff. We had a section here on non-housing funding strategy. So Randy from DOH flagged this and said, hey, I'm not sure we can make recommendations on funding that we don't control. So that's noted. I have a question to her in terms of whether it's okay, for example, in the case of setting targets for municipalities for the Department of Housing to set, I don't want to use the term aspirational, but like realistic broad goals, but acknowledge that there's some components of funding streams that either they or CHFA don't necessarily control. And this also gets to our conversation about actors, right? And the fact that there are many other parties involved in developing affordable housing, which are not the government, or which are local government or private developers or philanthropic foundations. And I think what we were trying to say here was that if the consolidated plan is expanded to go beyond the recommendations of HUD, and we use it as a broader tool for housing planning, that including strategies that are non-housing related or involve, other actors could be something that was included. Again, Randy noted that there may be some challenges here from the DOH side. So I wanted to flag that for all of you. If you have additional input on the section or you have concerns about sort of the broad nature of the section, I'm all ears now or via email. I think the concept is good, but sort of how we say it is important, and what exactly we're asking the state to do here needs to be clear. This maybe gets more towards Rebecca's question about POCD too.
Mm-hmm.
That's a vehicle for housing planning, right? And it takes into account other components that aren't funding related. So should this plan sort of jive with that, for lack of a better term, in a way that makes sense for housing planning? Should those two plans talk to one another in some way? So this still feels kind of broad and unspecific to me, and I think it's important that we provide some clarity. I'll have some further conversation with Randy on it, but I wanted to seek your thoughts on it as well. This is where we had started talking about things like upzoning. Was a conversation. We had a lot of conversation around this, I think, at our last meeting. And so there's a couple spaces here where Kaylee and I have flagged to potentially add clarifying information or additional specific suggestions. Rebecca.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on what you were just alluding to. I would like to see the state plan of conservation and development more specifically address housing, regardless of whether your recommendations yield some other just strictly housing plan.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if this recommendation could morph into addressing these issues through a broad comprehensive land use plan, such as the state C&D plan.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I gotta raise my hand. I was told to do that. Okay, there you go. Okay, so I really like what Rebecca just said, because the POCD specifically says, the statutes specifically say highest and best use. And there's a point at which everybody has to stop and say, so are we going to do open space here? Are we going to do a school here? Or are we going to try to do affordable housing? So it should be tied in to the POCD. There has to be a balancing of priorities. There has to be a tie-in. I hope that was what you were trying to say, Rebecca. Yes?
Yes, and because some of what you're alluding to in these recommendations are about zoning and, issues beyond funding. And again, I'm stuck in the con plan is strictly about federal funding. I know you're making recommendations to broaden it, but in the context of other state activity, I think the POCD helps to put it in the context of other state activities, economic development, open space preservation, all of those other state actions that need to be balanced and or considered along with housing.
Okay, maybe we can work with this section to acknowledge that there are non-housing funding strategies that that both the state and municipalities are taking, and some of these recommendations for those types of housing strategies should be included in the consolidated plan, but perhaps that things like upzoning, for example, which we highlighted here, or incentives for opening up more developable land might be better placed in the POCD, and that they cross-reference one another. Will, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I guess one of the places where I'm a little stuck is like the POCD. I mean, to my memory, when Mike came to talk to us, he said something about the POCD being kept explicitly vague to allow them to like do creative stuff. And that seems fine and makes sense to me. I think like for me, when I think about something like upzoning, like that's actually like the POCD can say stuff, but that's ultimately the legislature. And I wonder if in fact, like we can mention the POCD, that seems fine, but I wonder if there's value saying like in saying something explicitly along the lines of a comprehensive housing strategy, like that the state can outline in this, or the POCD like ultimately needs legislative action. Because I don't know if that's relevant or even within our purview, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to mention it as something that can be done in a plan when ultimately it's the state legislature's jurisdiction.
Yep. Yeah, it's a fine line. Will, I know you're a really busy guy. Would you be willing to take a stab at these 3 paragraphs and send it back to Kaylee and I in a couple of weeks? Would you play around with the wording, and maybe we can float it by Rebecca too and see if what we're saying makes I want to make sure that what we're recommending makes logical sense for the folks who are putting together both of those plans, but that it also is impactful if a legislator were to try to enact some of it, if that makes sense. I want to make sure we're producing recommendations that are feasible, whether they're recommendations for POCD or the con plan, or in some ways making them talk to one another. Would you mind doing that, Will, if I send you some cookies or something?
Is that me, Will, or the other Will?
I'm asking you, Will.
Me, Will. I can do that. That's fine.
Okay.
That's funny.
So you have this section in the draft I sent out last Friday. So with these yellow things in it. So feel free to have at it. Finally, we have incorporating people with lived expertise. This was something that we felt many folks felt strongly. There's obviously a public process, and Mike Santoro went through that public process with us as to how the Department of Housing seeks public input on the consolidated plan. However, having something that explicitly says that the consolidated housing plan should include the input of people who are living in affordable housing, or perhaps even just different housing types across the state, would be really important, is something we added here. So this is a pretty simple statement. There's not a lot added to it. If folks feel we should expand it, this is just mine and Kaylee's take on it. I am all ears, but if folks have questions about this or feel that there are additional elements, I'm happy to take those now or via email. Any objections, questions? Margarita?
I hate to be a pain in the neck, but I got to go back to the building permits part in the previous one. I'm not so sure that data is still correct if it's pre-COVID. If you guys would just check it, because we went from being normal human beings to being so slammed during COVID, and since, I mean, we're just starting to see the light. So just make sure, because we're huge in building permits right now. And
Jim, is that your,
Jim?
you would have
Jim?
the most accurate.
Where are you?
Actually,
What would you
Kaylee
say?
told us.
So, I mean, I don't have data in front of me at this very moment. When we say huge in building permit data, you really do have to put that into perspective, right? Because prior to 2009, we're upwards towards 10,000 units of housing a year. I think last year we kind of maxed out near 5,000. So we're still at maybe not recession level building, but we're not building to the magnitude that people really think we are.
Okay, I can just tell you that we went from an average of something like 8 or 10 applications at P&Z to we're averaging 20, 17, 18, 19 every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah, that's not to
it's
say
a load.
that if we were to break things down by county, where
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's a Fairfield County specific. That's
there
where
you go. Okay, I'm being provincial. I take it back. Okay, sorry.
you're getting lots of building in your neck of the woods, Margaret.
Yeah, and despite the fact that we see this influx of folks from the city into Fairfield County, there is still an outward migration pattern that exceeds the incoming.
Yeah. Can you all see the slides? And I'm just going to ask Kaylee and Will. I'm just going to put up our next meeting dates. Can you all see this in front of me? Yes, the slides. Okay. Friday, September 30th. If you've said you're going to provide some information, can you please send it to myself and Kaylee by that time? Her email's on the last email chain that you got, so that we can package stuff up and get it to you before the next meeting. And then I saw Kaylee and Will both had their hands up while they are speaking. Since we're just at time, I'm going to put our next meeting date up here. So Will, I think you had your hand up first. Go ahead, and then I'll jump.
Just wanted to say the meeting has a hard stop at 4 p.m. actually, because we have another working group. So I just wanted to let everyone.
Great. And Kaylee, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say we moved from 49 to 48.
Okay.
But I'll verify that data.
Oh, okay. Good to know. May I ask a question of Will Biederman? So just quickly.
Well, I think we're going to turn into pumpkins, as Will saying, because they have to jump to another work.
Okay. Okay. So, I can wait till the next meeting. I'll remember it. I'll shut up.
Okay. Or just email.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for your time and for sticking it out for the entire hour and a half, and for all the great feedback. If you promise to send us something, please do soon, so Kaylee and I can get our side of things done. If you have additional commentary, please feel free to share it in the interim. But otherwise, we'll see you all in a month. Thanks.